my wife Carly and I love traveling in the summertime. It's how we mark our July wedding anniversary. Most recently, we've explored Europe, Paris and Brussels and Amsterdam and Spain, and this summer, Italy. We prefer renting apartments in each city we visit, dining in local restaurants and touring sites less frequented by the larger tour groups. Each trip has been more spectacular than the last. I should clarify. The delicious food, the warm weather, the museums, the cultural experiences and landmarks, they're all spectacular. Some of our experiences in the airport, however, trying to get there, have been maddening. You know what I'm talking about. The couple who refused to check in online before their flight, yet defiantly stood in the backdrop-only line because the other was too long. The person who, despite ample signage before security, refused to either check their bag or part with a cigarette lighter that they tried to take aboard. Or the hysterical passenger whose flight was canceled but refused to leave the gate to speak with a rebooking agent further down the terminal. There's something about such inconsiderate airport behavior that stirs my inner New Yorker. Don't they see? At the very least, their obstinance is unproductive. And for others nearby, their behavior is disruptive and often irritating. Like road rage in a congested city driving, the defiant passengers' emotions seem to spread to nearby passengers, igniting anger all around. Impatient passengers turn on one another, unwilling to show any empathy for their fellow travelers' misfortune. Anger seems to spread quickly in an airport terminal. It's fitting to reflect on this scene this week. This Shabbat we read Parashat Chukat, which illustrates the devastating consequences of Moses' uncontrolled anger. In this week's Torah portion, tired of wandering, the Israelites again quarrel against Moses and Aaron, complaining, "Why did you make us leave Egypt to bring us to this wretched place, a place with no grain, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates? There isn't even water to drink." After hearing this, Moses and Aaron turn to God for guidance. They're instructed to assemble the people. Holding his rod, Moses was to order the rock to yield water. However, that's not exactly what Moses did. Rather, Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock, and he says to them, "Listen, you rebels! Shall we get water for you out of this rock?" Moses raised his hand and he struck the rock twice to get water. Instead of speaking to the rock as God commanded, Moses grew angry and distracted by the people's complaining. He insults them, calling them rebels, and then he hits the rock. Moses receives a severe punishment for his behavior. God says to Moses, "Because you didn't trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of all of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I am giving them." It's because of what Moses did in this week's Torah portion, striking the rock instead of speaking to it, that God doesn't allow Moses to ever enter the promised land. The different commentators give various explanations for Moses' sin, each attempting to justify the severity of his punishment. One modern scholar explains, knowing that Moses was God's emissary, the people might have concluded that if Moses was angry with them, so too was God. Giving the people the impression that God was angry with them was a failure to sanctify God's name. And in rabbinic tradition, Chilul Hashem, the desecration of God's good name, is deserving of the most severe punishment. However, I think there is more to this story that we need to consider before passing judgment on Moses. Understanding this episode requires greater context. Just a few verses before Moses strikes the rock, we read that the Israelites arrived in the wilderness of Zin, the setting of this week's Torah portion, and Miriam died there. My teacher, Rabbi Mark Borovitz, reflects, there is no mention here, however, of any mourning for Miriam. This is the problem. Miriam was one of the big three. It was Miriam and Aaron and Moses who were the leaders of the Israelites. It was Miriam who watched over Moses on his trip down the Nile as an infant. It was Miriam who led the dance after crossing the Red Sea. It was Miriam who was the advisor to the women, and even, I believe, Moses himself. You see, Moses lost his sister, his confidant, and his best friend. We know that grief is powerful. It can drive even the best of people, even Moses, the archetype of humility, to misbehave. Bereavement leaves us deeply vulnerable, teaches one modern Orthodox rabbi. In the midst of loss, we can find it hard to control our emotions. We make mistakes. We act rashly. We suffer from a momentary lack of judgment. These are common symptoms even for ordinary humans like us. In Moses' case, however, there was an additional factor. He was a prophet, and grief can occlude or eclipse the prophetic spirit. So what are we ordinary humans to glean from this week's Torah portion? Certainly this portion provides lessons on consoling the bereaved, a mitzvah without limit in Jewish tradition. Viewing this portion through a wider angle, however, I believe that Parashat Chukat is another reminder that Jewish tradition values empathy and implores us to treat others with compassion. Even when we ourselves are tired or thirsty or grumpy, because we just don't know what the other person might be facing. We must act with empathy too, even if they are unable to reciprocate at that moment. Before judging Moses for his rash behavior, perhaps instead we can respond with empathy, acknowledging his grief in the days following his sister's passing. Then we might use that practice in our everyday lives, helping us to reframe situations that would otherwise be maddening. Do you remember the couple from the airport that I told you about who didn't check in online before their flight and were tying up the bag drop only line? I later overheard them say that they were supposed to be on an earlier flight the evening before and feared having to cancel their 60th anniversary vacation they had planned for more than a year. They didn't know how to access the internet from their phones. How about the hysterical passenger whose flight was canceled but refused to leave the gate to speak with the rebooking agent? In tears, he told the gate agent that he had been traveling for 24 hours and hadn't eaten a decent meal and he hadn't slept in more than a day. He was exhausted. This week's Torah portion offers a glimpse of Moses the mortal, Moses the human being. He behaves like any one of us might have if we were in his shoes. That's the Torah gem that Chukat offers this week. If Moses experienced a temporary lapse because because of his overwhelming grief, then surely we, ordinary humans, are not immune from such misbehavior too. We sometimes act out too when we're tired and thirsty, when we're not feeling so well, when we're struggling with a looming crisis at work or at home. Perhaps, though, we can train ourselves to react to another's acting out with empathy rather than anger. Or we just don't know everything they're managing at the moment. Surely such a practice can make for more pleasant encounters, both standing in line at the airport and in the regular ongoings of our daily lives.